So this is going to be a video on how to research and case write an LD debate. I apologize for the terrible video quality because this is being recorded on an iPhone at nighttime. Oh well. So, the first part is research. You're going to want to start with general search terms. Try to learn about the topic and the arguments that people in the literature are talking about before you start picking which arguments that you want to go for and finding cards for those arguments. Think about the arguments that people in the literature are making so you have a baseline topic knowledge, and once you get an idea of what's in the literature, you can start picking what arguments might be viable, start choosing some that you could make and some that you're going to write blocks to. But remember to keep in mind all of the arguments that you can think of, so you can write blocks to all of them if possible. Once you've picked a couple arguments that you're probably going to want to go for, you want to think about what your case strategy is going to be. There are a couple strategies you can use for writing cases. One of them is positional casing. Positional casing is where you pick one general thesis to center your case around, and this usually is a well-developed narrative with a lot of strong links and complex argumentation to back up one centralized thesis. So there's a couple of pros to this approach. It's easier to defend against blocks and turns it's easier to defend against turns because your opponent, if you're only running one argument, your opponent can't just turn 3 or 4 of your contentions and then you have to refute all of them. They're only going to be turning one contention, so you can just refute those turns like you were going to anyway. But if you have 3 or 4 and your plan was to pick one of those to go for, you have to refute all of the turns and soak up all of your 1AR time doing that, which is going to leave you with like 1 minute in the 1AR to make extensions and then answer their case. Or make extensions on the contention you actually want to extend to the 2AR anyway. So it's easier to defend against turns because there's only one argument that they're going to be able to turn, and you're going to have to address those anyway. It's easier to defend against regular arguments because you have more front lines to your argument, you know it better, so you can bat away attacks more easily, and you have all the front lines. Hopefully, you better write the front lines first, though. I mean, you can also do something called deep warranting here, which is where you defend the assumptions that your links rely on. So basically, every argument has assumptions that it's making. You can look at those assumptions and find cards that defend those assumptions, which makes your argument have a whole nother layer to it, so it's a lot easier to defend. An example of this would be like in the current topic, if your argument is that eliminating subsidies for fossil fuels causes companies to stop making new plants or coal mines or processing plants to go out of business. Some deep warranting would be arguing that would make the company go out of business instead of go to another country and just start emitting the same amount of fuels there. Another deep warrant would be to say that those plants would no longer be profitable without those subsidies, so they would just stay closed and other companies wouldn't swoop in and pick up the coal plant. So what this does is not only preempt some of your opponent's arguments if they might make, but it also just makes your argument more convincing, even if your opponent doesn't go for the responses that this argument is preempting, or this warranting is preempting. So like these examples would just make your case more convincing, even if your opponent didn't say companies will just go to other countries, or even if they didn't say bigger companies will just swoop in. Now, the positional casing route will also generally help you in your last speech against lay judges, because you will have actually defended your one argument against all of the substantive attacks your opponents made on it, instead of having 3 or 4 arguments and picking one and just collapsing to all of the responses your opponent made to everything else and just going for that one argument, that's more convincing because it gives you credibility in front of lay judges. Lay judges will see that you actually defended your case instead of just collapsing on all of the arguments that your opponent actually refuted and picking the one they refuted the least, which they don't like because they think you can't defend your case at that point. And it's also good in front of lay judges because you can tell a cohesive story because your case is built around a thesis. It's super easy to crystallize and tell a story of the debate round, more so than if you have like 4 arguments and you gotta be like weaving all of them into one narrative. But having a bunch of arguments is also a viable strategy in a lot of cases. This is helpful because you get to pick which argument you want to go for. If one argument gets completely compromised by your opponent, like they have so much prep against it and like their arguments are actually true against it, you just didn't think of that before, and you just get like completely destroyed on this one argument, you actually have options. You get to go for a different one. And you can still win the round, as opposed to if you have one case argument and your opponent like completely blows it out of the water, then you're just screwed. But if you have multiple arguments, you can go for a different one, and it's also harder to attack that case because unless they have turns to a whole bunch of different arguments in that topic, they're going to have to attack each one of the arguments, and you just get to collapse to one of them and make that your voter and weigh it against everything else, which gives you a super easy path in the 1AR or 2AR. The 2AR or 2NR. And keep in mind, again, about what I said earlier about persuasion. What might help is if you actually properly warrant all of the arguments that you make, and if you try to get your efficiency up so you can spend more time in maybe the 1AR or the or in the NC, or 2NR rather, actually like extending your other arguments, just like put some defense on it, muddy the water a little bit, and then just like set yourself up to go for the argument you're going to go for. So maybe you can like salvage the perception of credibility. And this type of approach to casing sometimes works better in topics that might not have like a whole bunch of data, or where there's not a bunch of like clearly true arguments, because the topic is mostly based on like speculating about what might happen if we or like in the future. So like the cyber operations topic that's happening in PF right now doesn't really have a lot of definitive data to it. It's more of like analysis by authors. So it'll be helpful to have a bunch of different arguments, because there's really good blocks, or equally good blocks as like the whole case. So it's really hard to like actually extend an argument if you're just going for one. And you should keep that in mind, because the current PF topic might be an LD topic later on this year if it gets picked. There's a cyber operations topic for LD as well. So just fit what case you're writing to the scenario. Just make a judgment call, pick whichever case you want, depending on the topic, your side, AF or neg. Or you can just like craft your own strategy, just whatever picks or whatever suits you best. And then after you've picked a strategy for writing your case, you want to do some more research. Start compiling sources for all your arguments, for your blocks and frontline files. Frontlines are sort of like blocks that defend your case, as opposed to blocks that attack your opponent's case, by the way. So build your block and frontline files and your case files. What I like to do sometimes is have a folder full of sources and like a note below the source that tells me what it does in my case, or what it does to the argument. Grade it, see how good it is, and just explain what the source is actually saying. And then when you're researching, you actually want to learn about the topic. Cutting the card is not everything. You want to actually get something from all the articles. You want to learn more about the topic, because if you have more topic knowledge, it's going to be really helpful in round. not just for any interaction that you might have where you can just know more than your opponent, but also just for the perception of dominance. Because if you know about the topic like so much more than your opponent's going to show, and if for nothing else, do it just for that feeling of like having read the entire article that your opponent's citing in their case, and like knowing that 2 lines down the article contradicts itself, and just roasting them in cross-ex or rebuttal, or like knowing this author was paid off by somebody and be like ending their whole career in cross-ex. And that's super fun when you get to do it, but you only get to do that if you actually learn about the articles. Very rarely will you just like happen to know one thing that comes up and around. You have to actually actively be learning about the topic vigorously to be able to do this type of thing. And just a last note, if you go into college campuses, you can, if you get on their Wi-Fi, sometimes have access to their scholarly databases, which is super helpful for getting good sources and databases like JSTOR or whatnot. Or if you go to the NSDA website, there is a database full of journals. I don't remember what it's called, but you can get articles there as well. So, good luck for the rest of this topic and in Jan-Feb when all of the bid tournaments are, and have fun.